are conspiring to fail to test the constitutionality of certain sections, which pertain to everyday social interactions, and how the police would be involved in matters that might be considered sort of an escalation of, public disturbance or whatever it is. Well, these sections are Section 115 and 117 of the Criminal Justice Act 2006. The Irish High Court committed to testing them and scheduled them, commenced the court case, and midway through that court case abandoned testing the constitutionality of those sections, even though all of the other remaining items of that court case scheduled therein would have been automatically thrown out, dismissed or quashed if they found that those sections aforementioned were unconstitutional. So it's highly unusual behaviour then that they would fail to test the constitutionality of those sections, knowing that they would automatically, by default, deem the other matters of the court case dealt with, because they were directly impacted by whether those sections were deemed constitutional or not, or found to be constitutional or not. So the fact that they didn't test the constitutionality of those sections is remiss. They're remiss of their duty. So we can only come to the conclusion that there's some reason they're not testing those sections, which is untoward. Because in the conclusion of the court, in the conclusion of the judge, it was said that it remains an open question as to whether those sections were constitutional or not. So the court is saying we should test them. It still remains an open question. Yet they continue to deal with matters that would be directly impacted by whether or not those sections are constitutional. So this is a fraudulent position that the courts have assumed in failing to test the constitutionality of those sections. They were equipped to, they were set to, they were paid to, they were brought together to, assembled to, and mandated to test the constitutionality of those sections. Then they failed to, and still have failed to. It hasn't been done in the interim. But what has been done in the interim, which makes the situation for them worse, is that the High Court have ruled that certain aspects of that legislature, certain of the mechanisms within it, or incited by it, or encouraged through it, are unlawful. And specifically, that is, a member of An Garda Síochána is not allowed to prosecute in court. They're not allowed to prosecute in court. Period. But the sections that we're talking about here that were to be tested for their constitutionality call members of An Garda Síochána to prosecute in court. It has been ruled in High Court quite recently that members of An Garda Síochána are not allowed to represent the evidence of other members of An Garda Síochána in their absence or in their presence. But those aforementioned sections call members of An Garda Síochána to represent the evidence of other members in their absence. So these are two activities that are outlawed, that these sections that they failed to test even though they had scheduled to test them, encourage members of An Garda Síochána so to do. In other words, they're asking guards to do something that the High Court have said they can't in these legislations that they failed to test deliberately, even after they said they'd test them. This is extremely suspicious behaviour. It's absolutely fraudulent, conspiratorial, and treasonous because of the implications. What do I mean by that? How can it be conspiratorial? This is a big accusation. It's my belief. And it's my belief not based on hypothesis or theory, but what has transpired and what has come to pass. Because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 courts have come to realise that the testing of the constitutionality of those sections was requested in the High Courts of Ireland. And none of those courts have pursued it coming to pass. Even the High Court that scheduled it to be tested, that Act, 2006 Criminal Justice Act, they failed to follow it up. But even in their failure to follow it up, certain aspects of that legislature have been tested before the High Court. But they haven't said, well, we're testing those sections. It was just that certain things that those sections incite or ask the people to do were addressed by the High Court. So it sort of indirectly tested them without directly testing them. And even though it indirectly tested them and found that mechanisms therein were unlawful, they haven't removed those legislations. Which says that now not only are they acting conspiratorially because more than one court knows, more than one judge knows, members of An Garda Síochána know, members of the public know, solicitors and barristers and judges of the highest courts in the country know, the newspapers know. So many people know that the High Court said they would test these sections, that they needed to be tested, that they should be tested, and then failed to test them. So it can't be accidental. It's conspiratorial. A conspiracy is when more than one person gets together with another person or a group of people, and they work together to prevent something that should happen from happening, or to cause something that shouldn't happen to happen. They conspire together to do something evil. And it's evil not to test the constitutionality of sections, because if they're unconstitutional, they're harmful. So it's very suspicious, and this is not an evil suspicion, this is already exposed. It's very suspicious behaviour when somebody says, yeah, we'll test that, we should test that, remains an open question to be tested in an appropriate case. This is an appropriate case. We said it is an appropriate case. We're not saying it isn't an appropriate case, but we're not saying much, really, are we? We're just saying that we haven't tested it. It remains an open question as to whether it's constitutional or not, or they're constitutional or not. And it should be done in an appropriate case. We're not saying when that case is, or when it will ever be, or where it should be held, or when it... And so they're not dealing actually with the matter at hand, but they have addressed it, which shows that their position is one of a fraudulent and conspiratorial position that is designed to be harmful towards the people. because they said they tested and didn't, and they found that aspects of those sections are unlawful, and they still haven't removed them from the legislature. Many courts are aware, many judges, many barristers, many solicitors, many members of An Garda Síochána, the newspapers, many members of the public, they know, and they still haven't addressed sections 115 and 117 of the Criminal Justice Act 2006, which automatically brings into question section 113 and 114 of the same act, the adult behaviour warning system, because 115 and 117 are directly affected by those other sections. So in other words, you can't test 115 and 117 without testing 113 and 114 comprehensively and thoroughly. So why isn't this being done? It was scheduled to be done. I'll tell you why it's not being done. Because they're conspiring to conceal it, the matter, from the Irish people. Because they don't want to be perceived as having to test sections for their constitutionality if a member of the public requests it of them. And they do have to do it. They've already said that they're going to do it. And so they must do it. That's how the law works. The fact that they're not doing it completely exposes that their position was never genuine. Never. From start to finish. They were not operating on solid footing. They were not operating from a position of genuine concern for social order. Because if they were, they would have tested those sections to ensure that they were in line with the Constitution. So their entire position, motivation and aptitude in their role and in their office has been tested, and it has been found that they're unworthy and unfit to do their job. And not only that, but they're not interested in the welfare of the society or your rights as an Irish person, because they haven't prioritised or kept as first importance the testing of those sections to ensure that they were in line with your rights outlined in the Constitution of Ireland. So they're exposed in it. Absolutely. And they're still, years on, they still haven't tested them. They spent years in the High Court, and only in the conclusion was it seen that they didn't do what they said they would do, years after. They have seriously betrayed the Irish people. Seriously. And they've tried to keep it under wraps and under the radar as well. They've thrown me in prison. They've kept me under threat of imprisonment if I spoke in public for over 2 years. And they haven't even motioned to compensate me in any way for that harm done to my life. They said that they would pay me €150 court costs. I've emailed them over a week ago about how I would go about receiving that €150. They didn't even respond to my email. They're absolutely incompetent. the €1,500 surety belonging to me that was put down as payment for bail, as a bail bond, when I was being released from prison after spending a month in there, on account of not complying with the civil order, which was later deemed in court as unlawful in the first place, that there was never any lawful expectation on me to actually obey it. And they haven't tried to compensate me for the month that I spent in prison. They haven't motioned for it at all, even though it's constitutionally their responsibility to compensate people, to reinstate them to the position they were in prior to the harm that was brought upon them, taking into account the harm that was brought upon them. In other words, compensation. They haven't motioned for it, even though it's their responsibility to compensate people and to motion for it. If it's their responsibility to compensate me or on account of harm done to my life, measurable harm done to my life, as a result of their incompetence, then it's hardly up to me to motion for that or to apply for it. I don't need to apply for something that's their responsibility. That would be ridiculous. Oh, by the way, for the harm that we've done to you, you need to spend more money in the court system to see if we can compensate you for that. That's not how it works. It's their responsibility to compensate. That means the cost is incurred by them. It's not incurred by the person who's been harmed. Oh, let us charge you more money there while we consider your compensation. That's ridiculous. It's the responsibility of the state, of the court system, to compensate somebody who has been harmed by way of an incorrect implementation through the courts of legislature or whatever it is, harm done to the person's life, duress or trepidation or apprehension or the removal of wrongful removal of rights or freedom. That all has to be compensated by the state, by those who made the mistake. And the courts and the state are one. They're all organs of state. So they need to function properly and motion for compensation. But they're not doing that. And so it exposes them. Why would they not do it? If they found that I was wrongfully charged, that the civil order, the civil ban was unlawful in the first place, that saw me ending up in prison for a month, well then obviously they know that harm has occurred. This person has spent a month in prison. Like, that's no joke. For something they didn't do wrong. And we told them they did wrong and we put them in prison. We need to compensate them for that. Then obviously, if they're not going about that compensation or they're not motioning for it, that's further harm. So they're attempting to do further harm to me and my rights as an Irish person by failing to compensate and motion for that compensation. So they're just adding to their tab. You see what I'm saying to you? The longer they delay this, they're adding to their tab. If it's my responsibility to do something, I motion for it. I don't wait for the person that I'm supposed to compensate to motion for it. They don't have to apply for it. I do, if I'm the one that has to compensate. And so because it's the state's responsibility to compensate, they have to motion for it and communicate that to the injured party. They haven't done that. Which again shows that they're not interested in the rights and freedoms of an Irish person. They're only interested in appearing to be in the right or concealing the harm they're doing. And trying to show people in general, in the public, that you can't affect change. Not really. And to try will just harm you, and they won't even try and compensate you for that harm. So do you really want to do it? You see, the point is, they're too far in now not to do what they're supposed to do. Now they have to test the constitutionality of those sections, have them removed, and compensate me. And the clock is ticking. And they're adding to their tab. The victory is the Lord's, and the corruption is exposed. Let them be rebuked. We need to pray for our leaders, for our court judges, etc., that they do their jobs properly according to the Constitution and are not led astray by the demonic. In Jesus' name. Blessings.